Yesterday, President Trump criticized the BRICS for promoting anti-U.S. policy and threatened to impose 10% tariff hikes on them.
The BRICS are now emerging as really the only global forum that can stand up to Trump's trade war.
In the middle of an unfinished trade truce with China, President Trump has opened a new front. With his August 1st global tariff deadline approaching, he's now threatening to impose a 10% tariff on any nation that aligns with BRICS, the economic bloc led by China, alongside Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa. It's a broad, blunt move, and while it's meant to box China in, it may be doing the opposite, because instead of lashing out, Beijing is choosing something more subtle and potentially more powerful. Back in June, President Trump declared that a trade deal with China was signed and sealed. But weeks later, no detailed agreement has surfaced. The only thing both sides confirmed was a temporary truce, a 90-day pause on escalating tariffs, set to expire in mid-August. Instead of focusing on finishing that deal, Trump has expanded the fight. On July 7th, he warned that any country linked to BRICS policies, including using non-dollar currencies, building alternative supply chains, or participating in infrastructure cooperation, could face new U.S. tariffs. This message directly impacts countries like India, Indonesia, and Brazil, nations that aren't anti-American but are part of BRICS+. It's a sweeping threat that risks alienating both rivals and strategic trade partners. And once again, Trump is using tariffs not just as economic leverage, but as a way to force countries to pick a side.
And threatened to impose 10% tariff hikes on them. What's your comment? BRICS is an important platform for cooperation among emerging markets and developing countries. Cooperation. It is not a bloc for confrontation, nor does it target any country. On the U.S. tariff hikes, China has made its position clear more than once. Trade war and tariff war have no winners, and protectionism leads nowhere.
China has not responded with counter-tariffs. Instead, its foreign ministry chose careful, deliberate messaging. Beijing emphasized that BRICS is an open, cooperative platform, not a political alliance aimed at anyone. It said tariff wars have no winners, and that using trade as a weapon would backfire on everyone. At the same time, China is strengthening its position through diplomacy and long-term investment. Over the past month, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi held high-level meetings in France and Germany. The focus? Green energy, multilateral cooperation, and strengthening trade outside the dollar system. Projects like the Dabai nuclear plant, solar installations in Greece, and joint energy infrastructure in Germany are part of a wider push. It's Beijing's quiet answer to tariff pressure: create more partners, not more enemies. Meanwhile, within BRICS, China is expanding local currency trade, but doing so without direct confrontation. Countries like India have clarified they're not abandoning the dollar, even as they conduct more rupee-yuan transactions. It's a strategic shift. Rather than escalate, China is reframing BRICS as a development-first bloc, winning sympathy from the global south, while Trump's threats grow broader and harder to enforce.
Makes sense. So it's very hard to make sense of Trump for companies. Companies cannot invest if they feel there is deep uncertainty about the future economic environment. And what Trump is doing is creating a lot of uncertainty, not only for companies, but also for countries.
Trump's tariff warning may look strong, but there are three big risks. First, it's vague. BRICS-aligned isn't defined in law. It's unclear what level of cooperation triggers tariffs. And that uncertainty spooks markets. Second, it alienates neutral partners. India and Brazil both want trade with the US, China, and the EU. Threatening them for participating in multilateral groups pushes them closer to Beijing, not further away. Third, and most importantly, it gives China a messaging advantage. By staying calm, presenting itself as a responsible economic power, and avoiding retaliation, Beijing now looks like the adult in the room, especially to European and developing nations. And all this is happening while the US-China truce remains unresolved. If no final agreement is reached by mid-August, a new wave of tariffs could crash into already fragile supply chains. This isn't just another trade dispute, it's a deeper confrontation between two worldviews. Trump believes power comes from pressure, tariffs, deadlines, and demands. China, by contrast, is betting on patience, diplomacy, and building alliances one project at a time. But there's a risk in Trump's approach. In trying to isolate China, he may be isolating America. And by turning tariffs into a global loyalty test, he's forcing countries to rethink who they can trust. As the clock ticks toward August 1st, the question isn't whether China will retaliate. It's whether it even needs to.
On that, which is that this afternoon, obviously there are a few hours ahead of us, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce has put out a statement confirming that a framework agreement has been reached. And in this statement, they go on to say that some of the restrictive measures imposed by the United States are going to be lifted. Now,
Donald Trump announced that the United States had signed a trade deal with China. On the surface, it sounded like a breakthrough. But this time, something was different. China responded. The Chinese government officially confirmed a trade framework had been reached. But while Washington celebrated, Beijing remained measured, cautious, and calculated. The contrast between both sides said more than the deal itself, and it raised an important question. Who truly shaped this agreement?
We hope the US will work with China to implement the important consensus reached during a phone call between the two heads of state.
Both the Chinese Foreign Ministry and the Chinese Ministry of Commerce stressed that China expects the US to meet its halfway, leverage the China-US economic and trade consultation mechanism more effectively.
From Beijing, the announcement came with none of the theatrics. The Ministry of Commerce issued a brief statement acknowledging the deal. The language focused on dialogue, mutual understanding, and stability. No mention of victory, no images of handshakes, no press conference. Chinese officials emphasized continuity, not change. They described the framework as a result of steady consultations and positioned it as a step toward global economic stability. There was no reference to Donald Trump, no personal credit given. Just a neutral, almost clinical confirmation of the facts.
So this is not exactly a new trade deal. This was formalizing talks that already happened in mid-June.
Behind the headlines, the agreement itself was not new. It finalized terms that had already been negotiated in mid-June. At the core of the deal was a trade-off involving tariffs and rare earth minerals. The U.S. agreed to reduce its tariff rate on Chinese imports from the previously threatened 145% down to approximately 30%. China, in return, maintained its baseline tariff of 10% on U.S. goods. Most critically, China agreed to start reviewing and processing export applications for rare earth elements, a sector it dominates, controlling over 90% of global processing. Earlier this year, as tensions escalated, China had begun tightening control over its rare earth exports, creating supply pressure on U.S. manufacturers in technology, defense, and energy. In response, Trump imposed countermeasures, including tariff hikes and export restrictions. This new framework represented a pause. China would resume limited rare earth exports under regulatory review, and the U.S. would ease some restrictions. But there was no mutual tariff rollback, only a freezing of further escalation. The stock market welcomed the announcement. On the day the framework was confirmed, the S&P 500 rose nearly 1%, and the Nasdaq approached an all-time high. For investors, the deal removed immediate uncertainty. It signaled that the risk of new tariffs or sudden retaliation had been avoided. But analysts across Bloomberg, The Times, and Reuters pointed out that critical issues remained untouched. Technology transfers, intellectual property protection, and long-term tariff strategy were all missing. The framework appeared more like a tactical pause than a durable resolution.
In that, has Trump really gained anything from this? It's difficult to see. He's obviously going to try and paint it as some sort of victory, but we'll have to wait till we see the details.
Trump needed the deal. With mounting pressure at home to pass his signature One Big Beautiful Bill, he required a foreign policy win to strengthen his domestic narrative. The bill, which promises up to $10,000 in annual tax cuts for middle-class families, has faced Republican pushback due to its projected cost and proposed Medicaid cuts. At the G7 summit earlier that week, Trump left early, skipping private meetings with key trade partners. His administration insists that more deals are coming, including with India and the UK, aiming for completion by Labor Day. This China framework is the first on that path, but it's far from decisive. In Washington, the framework was announced with enthusiasm. In Beijing, it was acknowledged with restraint. There was no ceremony, no coordinated messaging, no sign of celebration. The tone from China suggested a calculated move, a step to manage risk, not to concede. Trump framed it as a win. But the quiet confidence from Beijing hinted that this was a deal they had already prepared to accept. And that leaves one final question. Was this Trump's breakthrough or China's quiet containment?
On Friday, we had this so-called trade truce between U.S. and China. U.S. has confirmed a trade deal, China has confirmed it. But what are the details? Do we exactly know what's in the details?
Yeah, there's plenty of room for the China-U.S. deal to go pear-shaped.
President Trump stood in front of cameras and called it a win. Just days ago, the White House confirmed what it called a framework agreement with China signed in Geneva, then reaffirmed in London. Markets surged. The S&P 500 hit a new high. Trump celebrated the moment as a triumph in his 90 deals in 90 days campaign. But while the headlines screamed victory, the fine print was nowhere to be found. No official document, no detailed terms, no timeline for enforcement, and beneath the surface, the question was already forming. Is this a lasting peace or just a 90-day pause before the next trade war begins?
On June 13th, Beijing signaled a willingness to ease its restrictions. That'll buy some time, but insiders say it's a patch. The export licenses the Chinese government is issuing expire in 6 months.
On paper, the deal delivers real concessions. China has agreed to restart limited exports of rare earth elements critical minerals used in everything from smartphones and satellites to electric vehicles and military jets. These exports had been nearly frozen since April 2024, causing a 40% price spike within 3 weeks. Ford and several automakers were forced to shut down production lines. The supply shock was global. Now, with new 6-month export licenses issued by Beijing, some relief is on the way, especially for U.S. auto firms in Detroit. In return, the U.S. agreed to reduce key tariffs, cutting rates from 55% down to 10% on certain Chinese goods. The administration also loosened visa restrictions for Chinese students seen as a goodwill gesture. There's also movement on fentanyl. China has signaled it will take concrete steps to ban key precursor chemicals, addressing a major priority for the U.S. But here's the catch. None of these measures are permanent. The rare earth licenses expire in 6 months. The tariffs are only suspended, and the promises on fentanyl remain verbal. This isn't a deal, it's a truce and an unstable one.
They said China firmly opposes any country reaching trade agreements with the U.S. that would sacrifice China's interests in exchange for tariff relief, and then promised those unspecified countermeasures.
While Washington praised the deal, Beijing added its own terms. 2 days after the Geneva announcement, China's Ministry of Commerce released a sharp statement. It firmly opposes any trade agreements that sacrifice China's interests in exchange for tariff relief. The warning wasn't subtle, and it wasn't just for the U.S. Beijing made clear it would retaliate against any country signing bilateral deals with Washington that undercut its position. Behind the scenes, China is already delaying rare earth export approvals. Thousands of license applications are stuck in the system. Industry insiders say the flow of critical materials may take months to normalize if it happens at all. At the same time, China is holding back on fentanyl enforcement. Analysts at Bloomberg and the China Show report that Beijing is keeping that card in reserve ready to use only if it sees real movement from Washington. It's a chess game, and Trump may have moved first, but China has more than a few pieces left on the board. This was supposed to be Trump's breakthrough moment proof that his tariff strategy worked. And, in some ways, it did. The US got access to rare earths, a possible breakthrough on fentanyl, and a chance to avoid economic disruption. But every part of this deal is temporary, conditional, unwritten. China hasn't forgotten the last time a deal broke down, and this time, is acting more cautiously, using timing and bureaucracy to test Trump's patience. Meanwhile, back in Washington, voices inside the administration are already split. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent wants to keep the 10% tariffs in place. Trump says he can bring back 25% tariffs anytime. That uncertainty alone could rattle markets again. So yes, Trump got the headline he wanted. But what comes next will depend not on what he signed, but on what both sides actually deliver. Because this wasn't the art of the deal. It was the art of the truce, and that's a very different game.